Hey, Smart News. Today is about perspective, not perfection. Sometimes perspective can actually bring us more than a perfect news report. And I have to remind myself of this daily as an entrepreneur, but also as a mother. We all want to strive for the perfect something, right? The perfect news report. But sometimes it's just that little slice of perspective that just opens up a whole different way of looking at a story. And that's what I want to do today. It's easy to get frustrated with the news right now because any number of the topics that we're covering could be like a 15-hour documentary. We'd get to the end of it and still want to learn more. There would be still more to report. And that's not just for one news story, that's for about 20 that we're watching. So this is why the news is exhausting. We're in kind of this exhausting period. So I just want to take one big news story of the week, something you're going to see a lot of, and then add a little bit of perspective because some of the words that are being used in this news story by journalists and others can give a misrepresentation of the story. And if we know the basics of this term, which we'll get to in a second, then we'll be able to understand further stories. It'll give us a better foundation for the debates as they come, because this is going to be a story you're going to be seeing a lot of. So earlier this week, we talked about what was happening at the U.S. southern border, and we're seeing a huge influx of people at the southern border. We've seen this for months, but these new images are new. We're seeing in one particular part of Texas, a large group of Haitians have gathered and are attempting to come into the United States through this particular area. This has been very controversial. What you're seeing is the Border Patrol confronting some of these Haitians on horseback. And I'm showing you the video. This is from the New York Times, so you can see it in more of the context rather than the freeze frames. And there's a big debate about this behavior by Border Control. Some are saying, hey, these agents are trying to control their horses with reins, and others are saying these agents are trying to intimidate and maybe even harm some of these Haitians that are crossing the border. So this is a controversy that's ongoing. There's an investigation taking place. Those Border Patrol agents are apparently on administrative leave, but the bigger picture here is the number of people trying to cross into the United States. But I want you to understand, at least see some of that video in case you saw a picture out of the corner of your eye, you know what people are actually talking about. This was a lightning rod issue at the press briefing in the White House on Monday. And there was all sorts of questions about particularly how the United States was handling Haitians. Remember, I told you on Monday, some are describing what's going on at the U.S. border with the number of expulsions as some of the higher number of expulsions that we've seen for any group in decades. So the White House was handling a lot of questions on this. And there was one question in particular that got my attention, which is, hey, wait a minute. Why are we accepting Afghan refugees and not accepting Haitian refugees? And that elicited a response from the White House press secretary trying to explain the difference. But one of the things that no one did is really explain what a refugee is, who a refugee is. And that's why that's what I want to talk to you about today. I want to show you the definition because this is very critical to understanding immigration and what's happening at the US southern border. So someone with refugee status is a refugee according to US law qualifies in a very specific way. I'm going to read it right here. A refugee is a person who has fled their country of origin because of past persecution or a fear of future persecution based upon race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So you're fleeing persecution for a particular reason. If you scroll down a little bit further here, there's an important caveat to this. If you are fleeing civil war, if you're fleeing natural disaster, you may not be eligible for resettlement under U.S. law, at least when it came to refugee status. So I dug a little further into this, and the reality is that oftentimes in the news, people are referring to Afghan refugees when the group of people that is coming from Afghanistan into the country have not qualified for refugee status. What's more appropriate is to call them evacuees. They're being resettled under a different program under the State Department, but they're not officially refugees. And the Haitians that are attempting to come into the United States, they're not officially refugees either. That's where the question of asylum comes in. So again, if you're fleeing a natural disaster like an earthquake in Haiti, or if you're fleeing a terrible economy, if you're fleeing violence, even if it's a drug cartel, let's say in Mexico or in Central America, that doesn't necessarily qualify you for refugee status. It may, and that's where asylum comes in. So someone applying for asylum is someone that's actually in the United States or at a port of entry and attempting to qualify for asylum through a refugee status. So let me give you an example. Let's say I was living in Afghanistan. I'm a Christian who helps women's groups in Afghanistan. And I happen to be in the United States on a work trip this summer. And the Taliban takes over Afghanistan. And I'm in the US and I say, I can't go back to Afghanistan because I'm going to be persecuted because of my religion and because of my beliefs. Then I start the application for asylum. This is why the minute that someone comes across the US border, they go from either wanting to apply for asylum to potentially being able to apply for asylum and say I'm a refugee, which gives them a different legal status than someone just walking across the border. And when someone says they want to apply for asylum, because of that legal status, in some cases they're allowed to, they have to show that they qualify as a refugee as well. And that's a whole process. So I think it's just really important to note that as we're having this conversation about what's happening at the U.S. southern border, what's happening with the Afghans coming from Afghanistan, that we recognize that term refugee is being thrown around a lot and maybe not used in the most accurate way. This is really important because the Biden administration is applying or attempting to raise the cap of refugees that are allowed in America. We have a certain target number. And what's interesting about that is that news is coming at the same time you're seeing this other news about the border in Afghanistan. But what's really important to note is that a lot of the people that we're talking about in the news right now would not necessarily qualify for refugee status with that cap being raised. So it wouldn't necessarily have an immediate effect. It's really important. If you qualify as a refugee and you're accepted as a refugee, you go through a whole series of things. You get a loan sometimes to travel to the United States. If you're outside the United States, you get a medical exam. You're instantly allowed to work in the United States legally. You have to start an application for a green card, but it's a very different status than someone that's in the United States attempting to apply for asylum. And these are very different things. And it's a much broader conversation about immigration and how we're handling immigration in America. So just want to add this little perspective. Big picture overall that's getting lost in all of this is that the number of people coming across the U.S. southern border is so historically high. We're talking about huge numbers. And I try to give it perspective by saying these are the largest numbers that we've seen in decades, but it's at such a high level that it's almost difficult to bring perspective because you're talking about 200,000 people encountered at the U.S. southern border in just a month's time. And those are the people that have been encountered, not necessarily all that have attempted crossing. And so this is a really big story and one that we'll continue to watch, especially because when it comes to immigration reform, we're not seeing any real active movement on that. And one of the ways that immigration was going to be tucked into some other legislation through basically the budget process, and this is going to get a little wonky, a Senate parliamentarian, or basically the person that says to lawmakers, you can do this or you can't, said, hey, you can't tuck immigration legislation into what's going on with the budget because it's too big of a policy. And so we're still at a place where we don't have a lot of movement when it comes to immigration reform of any kind from either party. And by the way, both parties have been in power and held the majority and have been unable to really move anything. Okay, so those are just a couple. I hope that adds a little perspective. It's not the perfect report. It's not the perfect report. Always looking for perfection. But I hope it adds a little perspective about who a refugee is, what is the status, why it's very difficult to be granted asylum, and why what we're seeing here, whether it's, there's one news story about a particular border agent and what's happening at the border, it's part of a much larger picture. And we're going to get a lot of stories and a lot of headlines over the next several days and weeks about this issue. So I hope this is helpful. Questions and comments, let me know. We'll have more on all of this on our website. I'm going to think about a couple ways we can organize this information so it's easy for you to access. But I hope this is helpful. All right, guys, have a great day. And always more on smartnews.com. Talk to you later.